Welcome. I'm Yvonne Davis, and I'm here to tell you a story. These are the legends of the Fae. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Legends of the Fae, Episode 1. This story takes place at a time in history when humans used to fill the ocean with rubbish and leave it lying on the beach. Oh, they do that now? Okay, then this story takes place now. In her free time, Trinity cleared up the rubbish in the forest and on the beach, rubbish left behind by people who, for some reason, couldn't fathom picking it up themselves. In the evening, after her long, hard day, she sat on the beach and watched the sunset. How glorious it shone on the western edge of the water, a massive slice of burning tangerine, then flamingo, then raspberry. In the shimmering golden light, the puppets, as she had decided to call the forest spirits, sat peacefully in the fading glow of the setting sun. They looked like stuffed toys left on the beach by a forgetful child. She inhaled the sea breeze with pleasure, then set off in the direction of the cottage. As soon as she was inland, the air was cool and rich with the scent of crushed leaves, a refreshing change from the briny, humid air of the English Channel. By the time she reached the cottage, the sky had darkened from ultramarine to indigo. Exhausted, she fell into bed and sank quickly into sleep, though it was full of vivid, restless dreams. In one recurring dream, she was standing alone in the forest, so dark she couldn't orient herself in any known location. Her body began to mutate, taking on the form of a dragon-like creature. She sprouted wings, but not the delicate wings of a fairy. They were large, white wings, like that of a bird growing out of her back. Her skin was blue to match her eyes, a light blue Arctic ice, and her long blonde hair had a tint of periwinkle. She wore a flowing white skirt made of lace and silk. The rest of her body was bare. A long silk ribbon with a Celtic pattern etched in colors of purple, green, blue, and lavender swirled around her body, tickling her skin. It was slowly and gently binding her. A rustling sound came from the forest surrounding her. Turning around, she saw a creature, not quite a man, not quite a dragon, towering above her. His scales were green and blue. Sharp, horny spikes ran down his spine, starting at his forehead and traveling all the way to the tip of his tail. He stood in front of her and spread his wings, the elbow point of each wing fixed with a sharp talon. His muscles were more pronounced than a human male's. His body must be as hard as marble, she thought. Trinity was mesmerized. He walked toward her, holding the ribbon that was binding her. He pulled her toward him until her body was against his, pressing closer and closer, the ribbon surrounding them both, binding them together. It was as if this lizard man had risen out of the earth, his skin green like the forest, his eyes blue like the sky. The darkness surrounding them was black, rich soil. She could smell the forest on his skin, her lips parting slightly, waiting for him to kiss her. Awakening in her bed, Trinity's eyes opened. She shut them. They flew open again. Did someone touch me? But there was no one around. She kept her eyes open. It was totally dark in the cottage. No moonlight or starlight shone through the window. She turned over, pulled the patchwork quilt around her, shivering in the night breeze. Sitting up, she felt the draft fluttering in through the window and stood up to pull the paned halves inward, latching them securely. How had they gotten open? For the remaining hours of darkness, she lay awake in bed. Morning finally arrived. Curled up tightly in the quilt, Trinity watched the light of dawn creep in through her bedroom window. She knew what she must do that day. Find Artemis, or wait for Artemis to come to her, then get through the enormous wooden gates and see what lay on the other side. With her course set, she got up and began to prepare herself. Herman had taught her that when a sorceress does magic, she must go through the motions and act on faith, trusting that her intent will come to pass. If she does not act as if her magic will succeed, then it is likely to fail. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Trinity was clear on her intent and would go through the motions as if it had already come to pass. Once all of her morning tasks were accomplished, she headed out the door under the warmth of the afternoon sun and into the forest. She took deep, slow breaths as she walked along the path, inhaling the spirit of the earth, letting it fill and cleanse her, and then slowly releasing it back to the earth. The power and energy of the earth surged through her with each breath, traveling in at all points, moving up and down her spine, out to her extremities, and back to her heart in a steady, rhythmic pulse. No thought of the journey filled her mind, only her being as if she existed in that moment, walking step by step along the path, breathing in, breathing out, feeling the energy flowing through her body. The trust between herself and the forest had grown over the months. She knew that Artemis would appear at exactly the place and time that it was meant to happen, and not a moment sooner. So there was no point in wasting energy, thinking or worrying about it. If Artemis did not appear on that day, Trinity would return to the cottage and try the next day, and every day until the magic had done its work. Her steps took her deeper and deeper into the forest. The path began an ascent until she finally reached the highest point in Needle Hamlet and looked out over the entire valley, the forest, the town, the pastures, and the fields. The rays of the sun shone at an angle that illuminated the colors with brilliant hues. The greens were not simply green. They were like emerald fire, the blues like Arctic ice, the reds like glowing rubies. The sight before her was a gift beyond any price. A frisson of joy flowed through her being. At that moment, a tree began to move and take on a human shape, tall, powerful, and yet clearly feminine. Artemis emerged. She was wearing a headband made from a conch shell that crossed her forehead and pointed downward between her brows. A strange sadness filled her eyes, something Trinity had never seen before. "Are you all right?" Trinity asked. Artemis held out her arms. Long, deep cuts ran down the length of her arms. "What happened to you?" "The same thing that always happens every day." She crouched down, arms resting on her knees, head tipped downward. "They cut deep wounds in my forests every single day. I fear I will not live much longer." Artemis was a warrior, but also a goddess, and in that moment Trinity saw her as the goddess, the great mother and nurturer of all life on earth. "I don't know if I will make it. I don't know if we will make it," Artemis said. "Don't say that." Trinity crouched down next to her. "Aren't you angry?" she asked. "Look what we humans have done to you." Artemis shook her head. "You've grown up in a world so separate from me. You don't realize that you and I are one." They stood and gazed out at the valley below as the sun continued to set. Then Artemis turned to Trinity. She unclasped the scabbard from her thigh and handed it to Trinity. The scabbard held a dagger. Trinity pulled it from the scabbard and turned it over in her hand, feeling its weight and power. It was clearly an ancient object that stored power in its every atom. For a moment, Trinity wondered if she was worthy of such a powerful tool, but just as quickly she banished the thought. She had committed herself to this journey, and she would follow it to the end. There was no stopping now. Artemis turned toward Trinity. "Come with me. I will guide you back to the gates." They headed down the hill. Trinity let the gravity of the slope pull her along. Picking up her pace, she ran after Artemis, her long hair flowing behind. Her breath was steady in her lungs, and she made it all the way to the gates as the evening star shone in the sky. They left the trail and passed through a thicket of trees until they reached the high stone wall covered so entirely with moss and vines, the foliage so thick she could barely see the wall at all. Feeling her way along, she eventually reached the two huge medieval doors that rose as high as the stone walls on either side. "Now what?" Trinity asked. There was no answer. She looked around. As usual, Artemis had disappeared. Trinity rolled her eyes and shook her head. "Not again." The light was waning, and she would have to head back before it got too dark. She tried the handle and pushed, but nothing happened. Stepping back, standing directly in front of the looming wooden doors, focusing all of her intent and desire, she visualized them opening. Energy surged up from the earth, through her feet and body, filling her completely. She slowly raised her hands, faced her palms to the doors, and stated with absolute conviction, "You will open." Without letting her focus drift for even a moment, she watched as the two gigantic doors began to move inward.